Okay, I would like to make one small request. Some of you are aware I suffer from a bit of anxiety. Others may not be aware of that until the day that I burst out crying for no reason in front of them. I do suffer from a bit of anxiety, so I request that everyone remain decorous, and if you have a question that will interrupt my regular flow before I ask questions, just raise a hand, and I'll get to the end of what I'm saying and then to call on you. But otherwise, we should get going. So, what is social justice? A few examples of what we call social justice motions are: this house opposes pornography. This house would fund sex reassignment surgery. This house supports women in combat roles. This house would ban religious leaders from publicly supporting political candidates. Motions about sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, religious discrimination. They're motions where we attempt to address inequality between different groups and individuals within society. That is, privilege and oppression. In debate, we do not much speak of interpersonal oppression, interpersonal racism, interpersonal sexism. Things like your racist grandmother who thinks Sri Lankans shouldn't be allowed to ski, or that kid who used to carve anti-gay slurs into all the desks in junior high, or that creepy guy at the bar who tries to chat up women who are too drunk to stand straight. Except as anecdotal evidence to explain broader phenomena. We speak more so about the structural causes of oppression, the ways in which society is structured as a system to ensure the dominance of some groups over others in a gendered and racialized manner, among other things. It is less, grandma grew up in a different time, and over Thanksgiving she had a little too much sherry, and more widespread structural discrimination results in adverse outcomes for certain groups, regardless of the intentions of those complicit in forwarding that particular organization of society. We need to see how this affects people as groups within society. We look at the way in which things like voting restrictions and reductions in social services are disproportionately likely to affect the lives of members of racial, sexual, gendered, and religious underclasses. Because the most common, most pernicious expressions of oppression are largely invisible to the majority of the population. Discrimination does not oppress as an isolated incident, but as a rule. Oppression is often not a function of passionate hatred, but of devaluation and dehumanization. Damn it, Cito. Come in, sit down. So, is that clear? Any questions thus far? Okay, another slide. Aren't you lucky? So, social justice is the effort to create a fairer society by addressing privilege and oppression. These are two words that one hears frequently in regards to social justice: privilege and oppression. But what do they mean? Perhaps it is best we define our terms. Theoretically, we live in a meritocracy, a society organized by merit, where social status is allocated based on contribution, where skill, ability, and contribution to society is rewarded. After all, effort and good work should be rewarded. The most skilled should be lauded, and the most hardworking promoted, without other considerations. In practical terms, however, this is often not the case, with a mix of merit and arbitrary traits deciding status in even the most egalitarian of societies. In addition to merit, need is generally recognized as another legitimate justification for additional resources. We see physical and mental disability as adequate reason for what assistance is necessary to ensure the person may function as a member of society. Such allowances are seen as equalizers rather than rewards, as merit-based distinctions are. For example, wheelchair ramps aren't intended to reward the wheelchair-bound for any supplementary benefit they bring to society. They are to make sure that what are considered baseline rights, things that every person should have, such as access to public buildings, are available to everyone without exclusion. In contrast to these justified social distinctions, which one considers fair and just, we have privilege, which is social distinctions and discrepancy in resource allocation based on arbitrary factors. Benefits to groups and individuals who don't deserve or haven't earned that additional privilege. Unlike an energetic or skilled worker whose labor is to the benefit of all, a person with light skin brings no particular value to society that is greater than a person with dark skin. All genders have proven themselves equally capable of performing duties both at home and in the workplace, and homosexual couples are equally fit to raise children as their heterosexual counterparts. Nevertheless, these differences have a profound impact on how a given individual is treated. Conversely, we have oppression, which is quite a bit more difficult to properly explain, but is roughly the equal opposite of privilege. Questions? No. That's either good or bad. Okay. So, I want you to imagine a situation where we have a white man and a black woman. I'm not going to make you guess which one is which. We're going to give them arbitrary gender signifiers. There we go. There we go. That is either a white man and a black woman, or it's Tom Selleck and Louis XIV. You see the lovely little mustache and the nice natural afro. Okay. So, this man and this woman, they go into a job interview as two candidates for a single position. Statistically speaking, the employer is likely a white man. They are equally qualified for the position, but suppose the white man gets the job. A question: was that sexist? Was that racist? No, or at least probably not. The employer in question likely never even thought of his choice in such a light. Both candidates were equally qualified, and perhaps the white male candidate had, in this instance, a personality more suited to the needs of the position, or perhaps a better rapport with his potential new boss. Maybe he had a nice long list of volunteer work and extracurriculars. Now, imagine it's not just one black woman and one white man. It's thousands of them, millions of them, all equally qualified, all running against one another for positions at good, well-paying jobs. Suppose that 75% of the time, the white man is accepted, and 25% of the time, the black woman is. Even in those 25% of cases, that woman likely struggles for recognition in her new position and is passed over for promotion, even for her less qualified, less hardworking peers. Of those women who do not become hired, a few will attain a similar position later on. Still others will settle for lower paying positions below their skill level. But a substantial portion will be unable to find work at all, and eventually, without a recent job in the resume, they will become essentially unemployable. So what just happened? In theory, if we lived in a merit-based society, a black woman and a white man of equal skill should have similar status, similar job prospects, and similar pay. Time and time again, reality fails to meet this expectation. Why? Many of what are considered prime leadership qualities, confidence, competitiveness, assertiveness, authority, are masculine coded. They are traits whose dominant cultural depiction is male and macho, and often whose presence in real women and in fictional depiction, in fictional female representations, is presented as negative or childish. They are traits that we associate far more with men than women, even when their behavior is the same. Feminine-coded traits, such as kindness, compassion, cooperation, and empathy, are considered liabilities in the competitive world of corporate culture. Words are not neutral. They contain associations, connotations, assumptions. Words have a history and they have an agenda. You can call a woman handsome and you can call a man beautiful, but both terms prime us to expect one or the other. Furthermore, when women do display the same traits as men, their behavior is interpreted very differently. Where a man is confident, a woman is arrogant, stuck up. Where a man is professional, a woman is frigid. Where a man is authoritative, a woman is bossy. Where a man is charming, a woman is flirty. There is very much a catch-22 when women who portray traditionally feminine traits aren't taken seriously, and women who portray traditionally masculine traits are stigmatized as bitchy and difficult. And this isn't isolated to women. Where a white man is assertive, a black man is angry, aggressive. It's the same behavior seen through a very different lens. Furthermore, while men are rewarded for things they do in their spare time, like volunteerism and sports, women are often saddled with the cultural baggage of primary caretaker of children, even after women join the workforce. So even if both candidates in our example had kids, she would likely have to devote more time to them, while he had the free time to engage in other things to pad his resume. Women don't get the same credit for the time they spend with their children parallel to their careers and their educations. In fact, it's a black mark against them. While a father with 2 children would be applauded for taking on a demanding 60-hour-a-week job, this is seen as negligent on the part of a mother, who should devote more time to her children. So, an employer need not think of a potential hires in a gendered or racial light. Our cultural associations already prime us to view gender and race as intrinsically connected to certain traits. The employer has no intention of being racist or sexist. His goal is to find a relatable employee with good leadership qualities. Of course, he is far more likely to share a background and a common worldview with another white man. But furthermore, he is far more likely to interpret that white man's behavior as an indication of qualities which he has been primed to associate with masculinity and maleness, qualities which he is likewise primed to associate with leadership. The problem with our first scenario is not that the boss is sexist, or that it is somehow unfair to choose one equally qualified candidate over another. The problem is that that man and that woman never had a 50-50 chance walking into that office. Oh God, I lost myself. It's right at the end of the paragraph. So the problem is that that man and that woman never had a 50-50 chance walking into that office. And that is what we call discrimination or structural oppression. Any questions? No. Okay, Kate says I'm doing well. Excellent. Yes.
What's an example of a debate motion that might be about structural oppression?
Well, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, this house would ban religious leaders from explicitly specifically advocating for a candidate. One of the major people affected by this motion are black groups in the United States, whose political leaders are often also their religious leaders. There's a lot of reverends in the history of black politics in America. So what you are doing when you say, hey, no, we're not going to let religious leaders who have this immense power over their congregation, we're not going to let them be involved in politics. What you also end up doing is hamstringing the most important political leaders in black culture. So you end up accidentally, for the most part, reducing the political clout of black communities. Because their most important cultural groups, their most important cultural centers have been restricted from political life. So that's an example of where black individuals, if that law was put in place, would be at a structural disadvantage. You also end up with this if you're going to say, you're going into a round where you want to say, put literacy requirements on voting. The problem with literacy requirements on voting, because you think, hey, we want people to be literate, we want educated people voting, so only people who are educated should get a chance to vote. The problem with that is it tends to be racial and gender minorities who have less of an access to education. So inadvertently, you are restricting a large poor population, a large ethnic minority population, and quite a few women from the vote. So when we're thinking of a structural disadvantage, that's what we're talking about. Okay. On proposition, we must ask, how do we address inequality? Imagine an ideal world, a better world, a world where this doesn't happen, where everyone is free and equal and respected for what they do instead of what they are. That world is our goal. Then think of a way to bring that world, with all its flaws and failures, closer to that ideal. The basic, what are we trying to achieve and how do we achieve it? The mechanism is vital in these kinds of rounds, and you will need to devote time to how it works and how it realizes your goals. It is not enough to say why your goal is good, because everyone agrees that people being free and happy and unoppressed is a good thing. So your opposition is going to hit you hard on your mechanism. Two of the most important ideas here are autonomy and equality, and they are closely tied. One of the best ways to increase people's equality is to give them more autonomy, that is, control over their own affairs, so that their needs aren't subordinate to a ruling class. One of the best ways to increase people's autonomy is to ensure their equality, their power in relation to others, so that they are equal in strength and influence to those who would curb their freedoms. Often, actions that increase one will increase the other because the two are very much linked. Groups that suffer from discrimination are often politically disenfranchised and hampered from making effective change through legitimate channels, which is why they're more often associated with popular movements. Women weren't given the vote. American blacks didn't get civil rights because the powers that be just thought that that would be a nice thing to do. They got these advancements because they leveraged what power they did have into making their oppression impossible for the system to sustain. Something which is much easier to do when these oppressed groups have access to education, access to information, free speech, open communication, and economic stability. You can use power to get freedom. You can use freedom to get power. Remember that when dealing with rounds about race-based scholarships and gender quotas in democratic institutions. Likewise, remember the importance of examples. Rights movements gain ground far faster these days than they used to, by using the example of previous movements and also due to the inspiration of depictions of resistance, both real and fictional. Having people like you in positions of power and influence matters, even when the example is a purely cultural image. When legal change does come, it is through either appeals to the rest of the democratic electorate and the legislature, or appeals to elites and the courts. And there are plenty of examples of both. Courts are often ahead of the rest of the population when it comes to recognizing and addressing an unjust system, which has been the case with both slavery and the rights of sex and gender minorities. But there are times when action by the courts only results in de jure change, that is, the end of oppression enshrined by law, such as legal segregation and legal disenfranchisement, which still leaves the de facto oppression, where discrimination is not enshrined by law, but still occurs due to cultural factors. An example of this is the American South, where segregation and disenfranchisement were both struck down, despite the fact that they had broad support among the white electorate, but discrimination continued in other ways. On proposition, do consider which route you're going to take, who you're going to appeal to, because your strategies will need to change accordingly, particularly as appealing to the electorate often involves moderation on the part of the movement in order to appeal to the mainstream. Any questions? Oh, good dates. That's bad. Okay. When one finds oneself in the position of opposing social justice cases, it is important to understand that one is not arguing against equality. No motion requires opposition to take the podium and dismantle a couple hundred years of feminism, racial progress, and religious freedom in the space of 10 to 14 minutes. When you get a case like this House believes that slut walk is bad for the feminist movement, slut walk being the protest march against rape culture where many women dress in provocative clothing and take to the streets, on proposition, or this House supports affirmative action on opposition, your burden is not to prove that rape culture is really a good thing, and that this feminism business has all been a lark, or that racial inequality isn't really so bad. Rather, your burden is to provide a case for these policies either not working or indeed harming values, or to provide a case for how other equally valuable values should be emphasized or trump those proposed by the proposition. If you end up on the pro-life end of an abortion round, which is a rights balancing round much like David mentioned last week, your arguments aren't going to center on how it's important to restrict women's reproductive freedom. They're going to center on how it's important that we value human life no matter what form it takes. A good thing to keep in mind on opposition is that social movements are not monoliths. They are largely broad coalitions of smaller groups and individuals whose interests and values intersect with the broad goals of the movement, though these interests and values might diverge quite drastically elsewhere. Particularly when one's opponent presents a movement as unified collective, it is useful to remember and to take advantage of the internal divisions that exist in every large populist movement. For example, feminism is the umbrella term for humanist philosophies which support the equality of the sexes. But within the feminist movement, there are several important philosophical divisions, one notable divide being whether women and men should act against traditional gender roles, whether all women and men who want equality should reject old signifiers of femininity and masculinity, or whether every person should be free to choose their gender presentation, whether no person should be obligated to have their personal choices subordinate to the political will of a collective, no matter its goals, even if those choices play into current cultural norms and stereotypes of sex and gender. These two views on the purpose of feminism, one emphasizing dissatisfaction with the disempowerment of women, the dominance of men, and the subordinance of women, the other emphasizing freedom of choice, no matter what that includes, conformity or disconformity. In another example, the leaders of many such movements have been led by relatively privileged subgroups, like the civil rights movement of the United States, which, much like similar movements in France, has traditionally been headed by the black intellectual class and the black middle class, or like the LGBT movement and the feminist movement, whose faces and leaders have been overwhelmingly and disproportionately white, not because poor blacks and women and sexual and gender minorities of color lack interest or involvement or importance within those movements, but because of their relatively privileged peers are often in a better position to amplify their own voices and to focus their attention upon their single axis of discrimination, be it LGBT rights, be it sexism, be it racism. Unlike those with fewer resources and multiple intersecting axes of discrimination. For this reason, it is often those relatively privileged subgroups that disproportionately control the movement's resources and influence its decisions. An example of how this can worsen internal divisions, occasionally leading to resentment and splintering as less affluent groups find that their interests are held subordinate while their energy is exploited by dominant subgroups, many in the LGBT movement are critical of the way it is focused on the primarily middle-class issues of marriage equality. While focusing relatively few resources on the often violent discrimination faced by trans women and the endemic homelessness of LGBT youth rejected by their families. If you are in opposition, exploit those divisions and make them part of your opposing case. Play one against the other. It's important. Questions? Spencer.
What do you think is the best way to, like, if you had to sum up this topic in one thing in the debate round, the best way to win around, what's the best way to attack it?
The best way to attack it? I would say the best way to attack it is summed up in a single sentence. Who does this hurt? Figure out who the motion hurts and leverage that. If you, there's also the issue of intermovemental conflicts and intersectionality. Because sometimes the goals of one movement are directly opposed to the detriment of the interest of another. So, very much think first and foremost of who this motion hurts and how. Look at the way the feminist movement interacts with Black culture. Look at the way religious minorities interact with the LGBT movement. Look at the way the LGBT movement interacts with disability movements. Look at the way national minorities like the Quebecois interact with regional minorities like Aboriginal peoples, because oppression is contextual and it's shifting. And few groups are always privileged or always oppressed, no matter the circumstances. So ask which is the oppressed group in this circumstance, because if you can make a case that a proposition policy falls hardest on yet another minority group, that is a golden strategy. Particularly on back half when the front half of the debate has already said everything obvious. You will often be able to make a case that this thing which helps women disproportionately negatively affects a racial minority, or even affects a subsection of the feminist movement. You will often find that a lot of common feminist ideas, feminist movement ideas, are to the detriment of Black feminists, even though they support the right of white feminists. So that's an interesting thing to use. I would think that would be a useful way to go about it. Definitely, if you don't know what to do in a round with a social movement involved, ask yourself that one question: who does this hurt? You can even make the case for the rights of a usually dominant group, though one would suggest caution. It's important that you are making a case for a group. It's important that if you are making a case for a group which has a lot of advantages over the other, that you have very good cause indeed. Do not argue against the rights of the oppressed with the inconvenience to the oppressor. I have seen it, do not do it. The reason why it is important to emphasize the rights of the oppressed is not because their rights are more important. It's because they are more likely to have barriers to accessing those rights, whereas dominant groups usually have the resources to defend their own interests. Fairness does not necessarily mean treating everyone the same. Very much an example of that is disabled groups and the mentally ill. Treating them the same as you treat everyone else isn't fair, because that's expecting them to have the same abilities and the same capability of defending themselves. That's very important. Equality and fairness are not necessarily always synonymous. And sometimes you're going to have to suggest something different, something which is not the same treatment, but is nevertheless fair treatment. You can also argue this when you're talking about, should we have race-based scholarships? Yes, you are putting, certain ethnicities at an advantage of receiving these scholarships. But are these scholarships giving them an advantage, or are they merely adjusting for a disadvantage that the group tends to have? That's the question. My final recommendation on debating about social justice, now that you've decided to go to university and start experimenting with drugs and alcohol and civil rights, is to get comfortable. Get comfortable talking about race, talking about sex, sexuality, gender, religion. Get comfortable because you are a part of this conversation, and your opinion and your engagement is important. In the best of all worlds, one's opinion's validity is its worth, no matter the nature of one's birth. Our world is not so ideal, but we should nevertheless endeavor to hold ourselves to that standard. There may come a point where, in the midst of the debate, you say something awful. You open your mouth and say something that sounds just vaguely racist, and your judge goes, or worse, you say something explicitly, unambiguously racist. It has happened. Sometimes you might just have one of those, what on earth is coming out of my mouth moments. That is a risk we all face. It's okay. We make a distinction between accidentally saying something wrong and being intentionally hurtful. As long as you are coming from a good place, it will all be fine. We are a place for open discussion, and that can only be the case insofar as we are willing to allow that sometimes things just come out wrong. So yes, it is okay if you say something bad. We'll talk about it, it'll be fine. Any other questions? Did I do okay? Yay!
All right. So, without further ado, all right. So.